We're here today to talk about dialogue, and specifically dialogue in Myanmar and Syria. Each a unique context, faced with unique sets of complex, interconnected conflicts. I've been horrified over the past few weeks about the escalating tensions in Syria. Devastating violence being meted out as part of the increasingly dangerous-looking and ever more rapidly shifting international power politics. On the other hand, it's also really just more of the same. Now more than half of 22 million people forced into exile or registered as refugees, forcibly displaced directly as a result of violence. The war in Syria is a shame on all of us, really, and the way the media talks about it, all the more so. The media in Myanmar isn't much better, although here there's a different story. The first open election in a country deeply affected by 50 years of authoritarian autocratic rule and classic military-style dictatorship. A history with thousands killed, hundreds of thousands jailed, and millions forced into exile, some to escape, others to take up arms with the intention of fighting back. But last Sunday, just a few days ago, after only 4 years of a reform process, the first open election gave millions of people an opportunity to choose their leaders from over 90 different political parties. All of the parties had the right to campaign freely, and many opposition leaders spoke out frankly in the days leading up to the vote. That election was enormously significant for the people of Myanmar and the region, and it was an enormous step forward in the hard road to hope. Myanmar and Syria, two very different contexts, two very different forms of dialogue process, two very different approaches, but with a single shared aim, using the dialogue space to shift and change the perspectives and perceptions of the people within them. If we change the way we see things, then the things that we see will change. In countries like Myanmar and Syria, the people who can find it in themselves to begin to change the world around them by looking at things differently are the people that keep hope alive, and that will still be there when the violence ends. Bouncing back, ahead of the pack, getting on with building life again, for themselves, for their children, and for every one of the people around them. Creative dialogue spaces in which assumptions are questioned and in which perceptions and perspectives are grown and shifted make it possible for people to forge new human relationships. It makes it possible for shared understandings to develop and for different futures to be dreamt and planned. It is these spaces that can help us to step out of our familiar frames of reference and find the new, more hopeful ways of seeing things differently. Dialogue holds the potential to navigate the road to hope, to find the routes that without dialogue appear to be dead-end options, going nowhere slowly. In Myanmar, the dialogues that I'm involved in are about using the space that has been opened up by the reforms underway since 2011, creating dialogue pockets that give a wide range of community members a positive experience of a forward-looking exchange. The People's Dialogue Initiative, as it's referred to, facilitates creative processes that make people feel valued and appreciated, in which different perspectives and points of view are encouraged and protected. In Syria, it's about bringing people together who really dislike each other into the same room. Supporters of the Bashar al-Assad regime, together with those behind the Free Syrian Army, or from one of over 100 other movements aligned to one or another of the sides involved. The workshops include those in between, against the use of force, or just sick and tired of the war and of violence in general. These processes are about giving people an experience of the power of dialogue and the skills involved, so that they can then go back and recreate similar processes in different places. So in Myanmar, dialogue is about getting people to talk to each other. In Syria, it's about getting people to listen. But in both places, it's about believing that the way to make the future different is by being different in the present. In Myanmar, 50 years of repression have had a serious effect on the people. The culture of fear, mistrust, and suspicion that makes silence the default position for far too many people are the direct results of an historically oppressive and undemocratic governance system. Living under an iron-fisted government made keeping things quiet an essential coping mechanism, a strategy for surviving under the tight control of the military junta. Over many years, the practice of engaging, remaining silent, has almost become a part of the culture that permeates village life, even as the country begins to change and new spaces and opportunities are opening up. Over the past 4 years, the government of Myanmar has been working hard to build a ceasefire agreement with each of the various ethnic armed groups it has been in conflict with. There are 19 distinct groups who have a claim to be recognized within that agreement. 16 of them have a history of serious armed conflict with the government. 8 of those groups have signed the agreement, and it's likely that the rest will follow. This progressive nationwide ceasefire agreement is an historical landmark in a much longer and more transformative peace process that will fundamentally change the relationships between government, its representatives, and the people those representatives affect. The political dialogue framework that outlines this process has the real potential to widen and deepen the available reform spaces that the People's Dialogue Initiative has begun to take advantage of. We've been working with a consortium of local and regional organizations that have been using dialogue to get people talking to each other, and in so doing, helping people to realize that it's not only possible to share views and exchange ideas, it's also essential. Because if we can change the way that we see things, then the things that we see will change. Trying to influence a culture presents a formidable program design challenge. So we came up with what we call a small steps, long journey approach to dialogue facilitation, a collective effort of conflict transformation practitioners and program design specialists who've trained a core group of facilitators who've been working across the country to initiate a series of local engagements. The core group will eventually take on the training of others as the program expands. Local dialogue facilitators work in teams to run dialogue sessions in grassroots communities across the country. The long-term plan is to involve thousands of villages and townships and to build a resource pool of skilled facilitators who can contribute to the wider peace process at multiple levels. Typically, a community-level dialogue would be made up mostly of farmers, but also with some merchants, a couple of teachers, local craftsmen and women, maybe a community development worker, a health worker, a monk, an abbot, a young initiate, maybe even a local government official. Dialogue participation stresses the need for diversity across culture, class, religion, and ethnicity, bearing in mind, of course, that every context is different. But these dialogue processes have now spread out across the country, in the northern state of Kachin, in Sagaing and Bagon, in places like Shan, in Bago, and even in the contentious area of Rakhine, which has been heavily affected by communal violence, and in the urban centers of Yangon and Mandalay. These are carefully facilitated dialogue processes, skillfully adapted to each context, combined to nurture and contribute to building a culture of dialogue that is the antithesis of the culture of silence that is so strongly linked to the past. Dialogue won't be able to change everything that needs attention, but it will amplify the voices of grassroots people, and it encourages the active participation of those who need to be heard. The PDI initiative tries to drive a wedge between the opening doors of a different future and the doorframes of fearful uncertainty and a rigid past. Any farmer will tell you that a future harvest of rice depends on our actions in the present. Harvesting a future culture of peace depends in the same way on our efforts in Myanmar today. The way to make the future different is by being different in the present. Keeping that door of dialogue open and pushing it ever so slightly wider might make all the difference to the resilience of the broader peace-building process. At the very least, it will influence people, the way they think about each other, and the shared and different perceptions that they have about the world around them. If this helps to build a common humanity, then at least no harm will have been done. Dehumanization is at the center of why conflict escalates and becomes violent. And dialogue can be magical at putting a human face to our oppressors. In Syria, it is this element that's central to the process that unfolded. Of course, in Syria, as in Myanmar, There is a high-level negotiating process underway, but the extent to which this can be called a dialogue is highly questionable. It's largely made up of international actors, Syrian voices are marginalized, and key local stakeholders are essentially absent. Of course, even while this process moves along in fits and starts, the violence continues. Syria is a context full of complex shifts in dynamics. It's become a stomping ground for international actors to play out a geopolitical battle that has essentially reduced local actors to pawns and puppets in a grotesque Punch and Judy style drama with devastating consequences for men and women and children on every side. Within this mess of shifting alliances, compounded by the complications that elements like Daesh and ISIS bring, people are being pulled in every direction. Nothing is ever as simple as the media would have us believe, and in Syria, this is all the more so. The conflicts are about so much more than a group of freedom-loving Democrats organized into a moderate rebel army fighting against the autocratic, authoritarian dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad. But it's not our job today to try to unpack and analyze the contextual complexities of Syria. And in the dialogues organized by Mubaddarun, it wasn't our job to judge or to pick sides from the contesting forces. That ability to approach our efforts without prejudice and to avoid making the same mistakes that so many external actors have made was central to the success and effectiveness of the work we were doing. Mubaddarun, which translates basically as the initiative, is intent on finding ways of nurturing, supporting, and strengthening the brave peace builders inside the country who hold on to hope and who keep trying to make a difference, even in the midst of bombing, shelling, and the most vicious forms of violence and destruction. The work of Mubaddarun reminds us that in every conflict in the world, if we look hard enough, or if we choose to look at all, there are always people and groups of people who are trying to find alternatives to violence. And the ability to dialogue and mediate is usually at the very center of that. So the Mubaddarun work that I was part of focused on those mediation skills and tried to find effective ways of helping people to facilitate dialogue. It sought to give people a first-hand experience of what being part of a dialogue that was volatile felt like, and then pulling out from that experience the skills and the techniques that are needed to make this work in practice in other contexts with similar dynamics. So it's an experiential learning approach, trying to make people feel stronger and more confident, using the action-reflection model of Brazilian liberation educationalist Paulo Freire. I worked with Mubaddarun to design and facilitate workshop processes that brought diverse groups of people together from all of the conflict hotspots across the country into safe spaces in the hills just above and outside of Beirut and across the border from Aleppo in Turkish Gaziantep. People from Aleppo itself flattened by barrel bombing, from Homs racked by fighting between rival militia groups and local gangs trying to use the war to gain local advantage. People from Damascus, from Kuban, from Al Raqqa, from Tartus. Supporters of the regime sitting side by side with those aligned to the Free Syrian Army Forces and local militias, mixed in with humanitarian volunteers working alongside the Red Crescent and local medical groups, men and women and youth from the Boy Scouts movement. Those scout troop loyalists were clinging to an identity that allowed them to stay out of the clutches of those who saw no way forward other than violence. In the sessions, we also included extraordinary Syrians who were playing the role of trauma counselors, working with children and the war affected to try and mitigate the ravages of violence, even as it escalated. The first few days of these encounters were tense and difficult. The room would be full of accusations, suspicions, misunderstandings, the atmosphere emotional and fraught with tensions. These things take time. But as the days progressed and the dialogues deepened, shifting attitudes would begin to show. Anger, fear, and resentment would gradually be replaced with human connections, the discovery of common ground, and the rediscovery of a collective identity, a collective humanity in which the seeds of hope could be planted and carefully nurtured. Dialogue that pays attention to people and process can become a magic dust that helps to weave relationships of trust on a loom of deeper understanding. The famous Syrian dish, magdous, was often cited as an analogy in these encounters. A multitude of ingredients is required to make the dish delicious. Every ingredient brings a unique taste and adds another layer of flavor. Every ingredient is essential to its overall perfection. Every day would begin and end with reflection on the skills and insights being discovered about how to get people talking, and in Syria, more importantly, how to get people listening. The idea that our own skills at facilitating dialogue can be strengthened by reflecting on our own experiences of being in a dialogue process was essential in this approach. Participants would go back, not as experts with finely honed and finished skills, but confident in an approach to taking action and learning from it that would allow for ever-increasing effectiveness, even once the workshop ended. On their return, some participants were able to better negotiate local ceasefires, stopping the snipers during an agreed window of peace, which would allow local women to hurry to the market and back. A couple of hours' peace in a day of madness. It wasn't much, but for those women, it made a significant difference to their ability to try and hold on to some sense of normality in a world that appeared to have gone crazy. In several places, the free passage of non-combatants was agreed between rival fighters, allowing those who were being held siege to seek refuge. And everywhere, spaces were created that allowed people to hear each other better, reweaving a social fabric destroyed by violence, using dialogue to rehumanize and reconnect. Using creative workshops that include humor and music and culture doesn't change things as deeply as they need to be changed. It doesn't end the war in a place like Syria, but it does allow people to hold on to hope, and it keeps essential skills and hones them, sharpens them to allow people to become more effective in the work that they're involved in. That need to stay focused on hope presents a more personal challenge to each of us. The dialogue mantra urges us to become more aware of ourselves and to struggle against the tide to stay more connected. Connected across the divides of culture, gender, class, and context, helping us each to become more conscious and more effective. Staying hopeful and holding on to hope is a hard road, but our experiences of dialogue suggest that choosing the hard road to hope and using the hope that we have to create dialogue spaces around us is worth the effort. Really hearing what other people are saying, constantly checking our own perceptions and perspectives, building empathy, because the way we see things changes the things that we see, and the way to make the future different is by being different in the present. Thank you.